it's Nicole and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to talk about self-watering pots. So now that we are in winter, there's a couple of considerations to keep in mind now that the weather has cooled down. And I'm going to show you some of the orchids that I have in self-watering, both in organic and inorganic media. And then we'll talk a little bit more about how to adjust the care and some issues that I've encountered. So I personally use self-watering pots because it makes my life easier. I have 87 orchids, so I have to find ways to water them a little bit more efficiently. And there's usually an inner pot and an outer pot. The outer pot holds a water reservoir. Once you have a water reservoir, you don't have to water as frequently, and the orchid is pulling up moisture from that reservoir. Now this works a little bit differently between organic and inorganic setup, and I'm going to take you a little bit closer to each orchid that I have with each setup and talk about how it works and some issues that I've had and how to fix them. So this is my Phalaenopsis Sogo Vivian Leaf's Edge, and this is in a self-watering setup in inorganic media. This has Leca and pebbles on top. And let me take you a little bit closer so you could see how it looks. But basically, this is an always moist setup where we've got wicks that transfer the water from the water reservoir into the leca, and then it will wick the water all the way up. And I use the pebbles on top to prevent a dry top layer. Now, with this sort of setup, what I find is that I don't have too many issues in the winter because it is inorganic media. So that media is not going to break down. I don't have issues with mold. This is super easy, I'd say. One thing that I will call out is that because this is a much cooler type of medium, I want to make sure that it's never cool. So this medium will stay cool. I always try to keep it warm. Folks who have much cooler growing conditions may have a hard time with this. But otherwise, this is very suited for self-watering. And I don't have to make too many adjustments other than making sure this is warm. So I do have some orchids in organic medium, such as this Oncidium. This Oncidium is in a self-watering pot of sphagnum moss with a top layer of bark. And I use that top layer of bark to prevent the slimy green algae. I do have more issues with this pot. As you can see, the wick is black. That's an indication that mold has formed. And I find that with self-watering pots with organic medium, it's a little bit trickier because they are more prone to molding. So inorganic media isn't as prone to molding because inorganic media doesn't mold. Sphagnum moss is organic. If you keep that too moist too long, you can get mold issues. So in terms of how I take care of it in the winter, I have to adjust two things. First of all, I make sure that there's constant air movement. I don't stop that air movement from flowing. I want to make sure that when I'm watering as well, that it's not staying super damp, and the air movement helps a ton. Also, I'm watering a little bit less. I can't keep this pot too moist, or else I'm going to have a lot of issues. It's going to mold up. The wick is fine. A little mold on the wick is not a big deal, but if you keep that reservoir wet, it's going to cause issues. So in the winter, I keep the reservoirs empty. I want to make sure that these reservoirs are not full of water. I let them dry. I just soak through the pot in the sink, let it dry, add it back to its container, and I don't keep water in that reservoir. Now, one consideration with this orchid, which is causing that mold, is that it's a recent repot. So the roots aren't super strong on this orchid, so it's not absorbing all of the water and the nutrients. Let me show you another orchid which is much more vigorous that I'm not having this issue with. So this Phalaenopsis here is in the same setup as the last orchid. It's a much smaller pot, however. This orchid is very different in that it has a much more established root system. So if we take a look a little bit closer, you'll see that there's roots galore in this pot. So it's much more vigorous. It is absorbing all of the water and nutrients that I'm giving it. So it's not leaving a lot of moisture around to cause mold. So as you can see, the wick here is white. The last wick that I was showing you guys is black. So this is the same exact setup, but we're not having any issues with this orchid because look at those roots. They're growing through the pot, as you could see on the bottom. That wick is staying without any mold, which is great. but there's different factors that will cause problems. So if you have a new repot, less roots, you may encounter mold issues just because it's not absorbing what you need. This orchid in particular is taking the water that I'm giving it and the fertilizer that I'm giving it and developing new roots, new leaves. It is consistently growing. That Oncidium is a little stalled, so it's not taking what I'm giving it, and it's just sitting there getting soggy, creating a little mold. In this case, I still don't fill that water reservoir up with water because it is winter. It doesn't need it. It's growing, but it's much too cool for that. And I want to make sure that that water reservoir stays empty. As you can see, it's empty right now. I water this orchid, let it drain, empty that water reservoir out, and then let it dry. So I'm going to show you one more orchid. This is my Miltoniopsis. This one is also in a self-watering pot. This is one of those orchids with a cone, one of those pots rather, with a cone on the bottom. As you can see, it's topped with a layer of bark and it has sphagnum moss on the bottom. Similar to the first Oncidium I showed you guys, this orchid didn't have a really good root system when I repotted it because it was stressed in the summer. So this orchid is throwing out roots now because the conditions are much cooler and this is what it prefers in its environment. So I am noticing new roots. However, this orchid took a while to establish. I have it hanging from one of my windows, so I did not check on it. So this is what prompted me to make this video. I wanted to show you. I was watering this orchid and I let water sit in the reservoir. And what happened is that I found a ton of mold in the bottom of that reservoir. So that entire bottom was full of like bad looking cotton candy, basically. And that's something you don't want. And that's a mistake, a big mistake that I did. I just got a little lazy since this orchid is hanging from my window. I didn't take it down. I didn't empty out the water reservoir. I wasn't giving it too much water, but basically I wasn't checking it. So how do we fix this issues? Well, for the Miltoniopsis and the Oncidium, I know that they don't have extensive root systems, so they're going to be absorbing less water and nutrients than I'm giving it. So what I have to do is basically make sure that the water reservoir is empty from now on. Now that it's much cooler, it's by the window, it's about 60 degrees, it's not growing as much. So first of all, keep that water reservoir empty for orchids in organic media. Next, if you have a mold like I did with this orchid, what you can do is you can spray some Phalaenopsis 20 or a fungicide of your choice into the pot and into the bottom of the pot where you're starting to see those mold issues. The fungicide will help get rid of the mold. In my experience, it's gotten rid of it, it's killed it off, and then you just have to prevent the issue from happening. So don't fill up that water reservoir to begin with in winter. In summertime, if it's absorbing the water, then that's fine, especially if it's in active growth, just like I've shown you with my Phalaenopsis. I'm keeping that water reservoir empty just because it's cooler right now, but cool and damp organic media can lead to rot issues. So just empty that water reservoir out, especially if you've seen some sort of mold issue. And when you're watering your orchid, you just want to make sure that water is not just staying in that water reservoir empty. So make sure it's emptied out. You can also increase the air circulation like I did with this Miltoniopsis. I keep a fan going, I let it hit it, and it helps dry the orchid. And I also don't water until it's approaching dryness. So Miltoniopsis like to stay consistently moist. I make sure it's moist, but I'm not keeping it soggy. So I water just as it's approaching dryness, about 10 days after I water. And I play it by ear. It's different every time. I find that the issues that I have with self-watering pots usually happen in the winter with organic media. The beauty about inorganic media is that nothing will really decompose on you other than the roots that are breaking down within the pot, and that's usually taken care of by flushing. But otherwise, the Leca, it doesn't promote rot. I don't usually see mold on my wicks like my other orchids, but this is all totally fixable. You just have to watch when you're watering your orchids. And just be careful that you're not overwatering. You don't want anything to stay super damp, super wet in organic media, or else it'll rot, give you some mold issues, and so on and so forth. So I hope this video was helpful. I like to share some of the issues that I'm having with some of my pots and show you how I'm fixing them and how I'm preventing them. Let me know your thoughts in the comments if you're using self-watering for organic media. How that's going and any adjustments that you've been making for the winter. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more orchid videos. I post twice a week. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and I will catch you guys soon. Bye, everyone.